Min-jun stood in the doorway of the staff quarters on the third floor of his penthouse, and something was wrong. The bed was stripped. The closet was empty. The small wooden shelf where she used to keep a worn paperback and a bottle of lavender lotion had been cleared off completely. There was nothing left in this room that proved Rebecca Townsend had ever existed. He had found out 20 minutes ago. His head of security, D-Ho, had walked into his office on the second floor with a single sheet of paper and a look on his face that Min-jun had never seen before. It was the look of a man who did not want to deliver the message he was carrying. The letter was one line, no explanation, no forwarding address, no phone number. I can no longer continue my employment. Thank you for the opportunity. Rebecca Townsend. Min-jun read it once. Then he read it again. Then he folded it, placed it on his desk, and walked upstairs to see for himself. Now he was standing in this empty room, and the silence in it felt louder than anything he had heard in years. Min-jun had run the Yoon Syndicate for 11 years. He had taken over at 23 after his father was betrayed by a man he trusted like a brother. The organization had nearly collapsed. Min-jun rebuilt it from the ground up, turning it into a billion-dollar operation that stretched from Greenwich to Manhattan to overseas. He was 34 now. Cold. Controlled. The kind of man who could sit across from a federal prosecutor and not blink. The kind of man who could negotiate with cartels in Miami and walk away with everything he came for. But right now, standing in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and absence, something unfamiliar was twisting in his chest. Something he did not have a name for and did not want to examine. Rebecca had worked for him for 2 years. She was his personal housekeeper, responsible for the penthouse, his meals, his laundry, his schedule of domestic things. She was the only person in his entire organization who never flinched when he walked into a room. Every single person who worked for Min-jun carried tension in their body when he was nearby. They watched their words. They measured their movements. But Rebecca moved through his space like she belonged there, and she treated him like he was just a man who needed to eat more vegetables and stop leaving his shoes in the hallway. She once left a sticky note on his refrigerator that said, "There are leftovers. Eat them. I'm serious." He had stared at that note for a full minute before eating the leftovers. She once told him his $4,000 bottle of whiskey tasted like angry campfire, and he had laughed, actually laughed. The sound had surprised both of them. She was the reason the penthouse felt like a place someone lived instead of a place someone operated from. She was the reason he came home at all some nights instead of sleeping in his office downtown. He had never told her any of that, and now she was gone. Within 48 hours, his house manager hired a replacement. A polished, efficient woman named Katrina. She was professional. She did everything right. She folded his shirts the exact way he preferred. She kept the penthouse spotless. She was, by every measurable standard, excellent at her job. On her third morning, she placed his coffee on the left side of his desk. Min-jun stared at it. Rebecca always placed it on the right side, next to the window. She had done it the first time by accident, and when he asked her why, she said, "Because you should look at something other than spreadsheets and threats when you take your first sip." So he started looking at the view every morning. He never told her that either. Min-jun slid the mug to the right side himself. Then he picked up his phone and called D-Ho. "Find her." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, she resigned voluntarily. It is not really our place to." "I did not ask for your opinion. Find Rebecca." D-Ho ran a trace within hours. Rebecca's apartment in Stamford was cleared out, lease broken. Her phone number was disconnected. Her bank account had one large withdrawal 3 days before she left, nearly everything she had saved. Then nothing. No credit card activity. No social media updates. No digital footprint at all. But buried in her original employment file, D-Ho found an emergency contact. A woman named Pauline Townsend, her mother. Address listed in Bridgeport, Connecticut. D-Ho sent someone to check. The house was real, but Pauline Townsend was not there. She had advanced stage kidney failure and was currently admitted at St. Vincent's Medical Center in Bridgeport. She had been there for 4 weeks. And Rebecca, according to a nurse who remembered her, had been there every single day, until 5 days ago. Then she stopped coming. No call, no explanation. She just stopped showing up to see her dying mother. Min-jun sat in his office and processed that information. He was not a man who felt fear often. Fear was an indulgence he had trained himself to suppress by the time he was 15. But something cold settled in his stomach now, something that felt close to dread. People do not disappear like this. Not completely. Not unless they are running from something terrible, or unless someone took them. Now here is what I need you to think about. Rebecca did not just quit her job, she vanished. Her mother is lying in a hospital bed with failing kidneys, and Rebecca stopped showing up to see her. No call, no visit, nothing. Something happened to this woman. The question is, did she run or was she taken? If you think you already know, drop your guess in the comments right now. And if you have not liked this video yet, go ahead and hit that button and subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. Now, let's continue. Against Deho's advice, Min-jun drove to Bridgeport himself. This was unusual. Min-jun did not do field work anymore. He had not personally investigated anything in years. He had an entire infrastructure of people whose job it was to handle things like this. But something about this situation, about this total erasure of a woman who had been so alive, so present in his daily life, would not let him sit behind a desk and wait for updates. He arrived at St. Vincent's Medical Center in the early afternoon. The building was old, underfunded, the kind of hospital that did its best with not enough. Min-jun walked through the halls in a dark coat, drawing glances from nurses and patients who could tell immediately that he did not belong here. He found Pauline Townsend's room on the 4th floor. He did not go inside. He stood in the hallway and looked through the glass window in the door. She was small, frail. Her dark skin had a grayish tint that spoke of months of illness. She was sleeping, connected to a dialysis machine that hummed softly beside her bed. There were no flowers in the room, no cards, no sign that anyone had visited in days. The whiteboard by her bed listed Rebecca as the emergency contact, but the phone number next to her name had been crossed out with a dry erase marker. Min-jun stared at that crossed-out number for a long time. He went to the billing department next. A woman behind a desk looked nervous when he sat down across from her, but she answered his questions. Pauline Townsend's medical bills were catastrophic. Over $280,000 in treatments, dialysis sessions, specialist consultations, and emergency procedures. Insurance covered a fraction. Rebecca had been paying out of pocket for months, draining her savings, maxing out cards, selling things. Then, about 3 weeks ago, a man showed up at the hospital. He paid $50,000 toward Pauline's bill in cash. The billing clerk remembered because it was unusual. She described the man as tall, white, mid-40s, wearing an expensive coat. Cold eyes. He asked for Rebecca specifically. He left a business card. The card was gone now, but the clerk remembered the name on it. Victor Ashworth. Min-jun's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. He knew that name. Everyone in the East Coast underworld knew that name. Victor Ashworth was not Mafia. He was not cartel. He was something that operated in the spaces between those worlds, something arguably worse because it wore a suit and carried a business license. Victor Ashworth was a fixer, a broker. He ran a network out of Westport, Connecticut that specialized in what he called debt resolution services. What that meant in practice was simple and ugly. He found people who were desperate, people drowning in medical bills, legal debt, student loans, any kind of financial hole deep enough to make a person lose hope. And he offered them a way out. He would pay their debts, cover their emergencies, make the problem disappear. But the price was servitude. Not the old-fashioned kind with chains. The modern kind with contracts and fine print and NDAs and isolation protocols. He placed people into service arrangements with his clients, wealthy, powerful individuals who wanted staff that could not leave, could not complain, could not say no. Some of these placements were domestic. Some were overseas. The contracts were structured to look legal on paper, but they were designed to be impossible to escape in practice. In certain circles, people called Victor Ashworth the collector. And now Min-jun understood something that made his blood go cold. Victor had not stumbled onto Rebecca by accident. He had targeted her. He had found a woman who was desperate, alone, and too proud to ask for help, and he had moved in like a predator on wounded prey. There was a moment, months before any of this happened, that Min-jun kept coming back to. A memory he had dismissed at the time, but that now felt like a warning he had failed to read. It was around 2 in the morning. He had come downstairs for water and found Rebecca sitting at the kitchen counter with her head in her hands. When she heard him, she straightened up fast. She smiled. She said she was fine. She said she had just been going over some things in her head and lost track of time. He did not press her. He never pressed her. That was the unspoken agreement between them. She made his world feel quieter, and he did not ask her to carry his burdens. But the truth was that she had been carrying her own burdens the entire time, and they were crushing her. Her mother's diagnosis had come 9 months into her employment with Minjun. Rebecca had no siblings. Her father had left when she was 12. She had been the sole provider for her mother for years, working 2 jobs before Minjun hired her. His salary was the best she had ever earned, but kidney failure does not care about salaries. The bills ate through everything she made and then kept eating. She never told Minjun. She never asked him for a single dollar. Because Rebecca Townsend had one rule she had lived by since childhood, a rule her mother had taught her through years of painful experience: never owe a powerful man anything. She had no idea that rule would drive her straight into the hands of someone far worse than anyone she was trying to avoid. Minjun stood outside the hospital in the November air and called Diho. "I need everything on Victor Ashworth," he said. "Every property he owns, every associate he works with, every contract he has brokered in the last 6 months." He paused. "And Diho, if he has touched her, there will not be a conversation. There will be a consequence." 3 weeks before she vanished, Rebecca was sitting in a coffee shop in Stamford when a man sat down across from her without being invited. She looked up from her phone, startled, and found a face she did not recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, the kind of man who looked like he had never been told no in his life. He smiled at her, and the smile did not reach his eyes. His name was Victor Ashworth, and he knew everything about her. He laid it out calmly, like a man presenting a business proposal. He knew about Pauline. He knew the exact amount owed to St. Vincent's. He knew Rebecca's bank balance down to the last cent. He knew her credit score, her work history, her lease terms. He even knew where she worked, though he was careful to frame it vaguely, saying only that he understood she was employed by a private household in Greenwich. The offer was simple. He would pay off every dollar of Pauline's medical debt, all $280,000. He would also cover ongoing treatment costs for the next 12 months. In exchange, Rebecca would enter a 2-year service contract with one of his clients. He described the client as a technology executive with a large estate in Scottsdale, Arizona. She would live on site, work 6 days a week, and receive a generous salary on top of the debt relief. There was one condition: no outside communication for the first 90 days. He called it standard onboarding protocol. He said it was normal. He said all of his placements followed the same structure. Rebecca's gut told her no. Everything about this man felt wrong. The way he knew too much. The way he smiled without warmth. The way the offer was too clean, too perfect, like a trap dressed up as a gift. She told him she needed time to think. He nodded patiently. Then he played his final card. "Your mother needs more than dialysis, Rebecca. She needs a kidney transplant, and she is not on the priority list. I have relationships at 3 transplant centers in the Northeast. I can move her up. Without a transplant, what did her doctor say? 8 months, maybe 10. Rebecca stared at him. Her hands were trembling under the table. She thought about her mother in that hospital bed, the grayish tint of her skin, the sound of the dialysis machine, the crossed-out phone number on the whiteboard. She signed the contract that night. She wrote her resignation letter to Minjun the next morning. 1 line, no explanation, because if she wrote more than 1 line, she would say too much. And if she said too much, she might break, and if she broke, she might go to him and ask for help, and that was the one thing she could not do. Not because he would say no, but because she was terrified that he would say yes, and then she would owe him, and owing Minjun felt more dangerous than owing a stranger. So she left, quietly, completely. She erased herself from his life the way you pull a thread from fabric, hoping the whole thing does not unravel. When Rebecca arrived at the address in Scottsdale, there was no technology executive. The property was real, a sprawling compound on 40 acres east of the McDowell Mountains, surrounded by desert and silence. But it was not an estate. It was a holding facility. There were 6 other women there, all recruited the same way, all drowning in debt when Victor found them. All promised relief, all cut off from the outside world. The man who ran the compound was named Ellis Prout. He was Victor's operations manager, a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses who spoke softly and never raised his voice, which somehow made everything he said more frightening. He took Rebecca's phone on the first day. He took her ID on the second. By the third day, she understood exactly what she had walked into. This was not a job. This was captivity with clean sheets and good lighting. The women were being prepared, documented, evaluated, photographed, groomed. They were being packaged for Victor's real clients, wealthy and dangerous men overseas who paid seven-figure sums for compliant, untraceable workers. Some of the women had been in the compound for months. One had been there for almost a year. Rebecca did not cry that first night. She sat on her thin cot in the room she shared with a woman named Joel and stared at the ceiling. She thought about her mother. She thought about the contract she had signed. She thought about how stupid she had been, how her pride and her fear had led her to trade one kind of powerlessness for something infinitely worse. And she thought about Min Jun. She thought about the morning he found her crying in the kitchen and did not say a single word. He just sat on the stool next to her and stayed. He stayed until she stopped. He never mentioned it again. He never used it against her. That silence, that steady presence, was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. She had walked away from the only person who had ever made her feel safe, and she had walked directly into a cage. On her fourth night, Rebecca found a cracked window in the laundry room that faced the open desert. She stood there for a long time, feeling the cold air against her face. She memorized the guard rotation. She started hiding bread rolls from meals inside her pillowcase. She did not know if anyone was looking for her. She did not know if Min Jun had even noticed she was gone. But Rebecca Townsend had been surviving her entire life, and she was not going to stop now. She was not going to be sold. She was going to run. Back in Connecticut, Min Jun was taking Victor Ashworth's world apart. Quietly, systematically, the way he dismantled anything that stood between him and what he wanted. Deho's team pulled financial records, traced shell companies, cross-referenced property deeds across multiple states. Victor's network was layered and complex, built to resist exactly this kind of scrutiny. But Min Jun had resources that most people did not, and he had motivation that went beyond business. He brought in his best asset, a woman named Soo-yeon. She was Korean-American, 31 years old, and she had spent 6 years at the NSA before Min Jun recruited her with an offer that tripled her government salary. She was his intelligence specialist. The person he trusted with information more sensitive than money or weapons or territory. Soo-yeon was the kind of person who could find a needle in a haystack and then tell you who put it there. She cracked Ashworth's encrypted communications within 72 hours. Buried in a chain of messages between Victor and Ellis Prout was a single reference that stopped Min Jun's breath. New intake, Scottsdale facility, Townsend, our evaluation in progress. Min Jun read those words on Soo-yeon's screen, and his face did something that Deho had never seen before. It emptied. Every trace of calculation, every layer of control just fell away. What was left underneath was raw, and it was terrifying. He now knew exactly where Rebecca was. But here was the problem. Min Jun could not simply storm a compound in Scottsdale, Arizona. His operation was East Coast. Arizona was outside his territory entirely. Moving a team across the country meant exposure to rivals who would see weakness in his absence, to law enforcement agencies that monitored his movements, to the FBI task force that had been watching the Yoon syndicate for years and waiting for exactly the kind of mistake that a cross-country operation could produce. Deho laid it out clearly. The smart play was a small extraction team, 3 or 4 experienced men, quiet, surgical, in and out without drawing attention. Min Jun said no. Deho started to argue, but Min Jun cut him off. She did not leave because she wanted to, Min Jun said. She left because she believed she had no one to ask for help. I am not going to send strangers to bring her back. He was going himself. On the private jet to Scottsdale, Min Jun sat alone in the cabin while Deho and 2 of his best operatives, Yi-won and T-Sik, reviewed the tactical details in the back. Soo-yeon was staying in Connecticut to run remote tech support, but she was on comms the entire flight. Min Jun stared out the window at the darkness below. Somewhere over Kentucky, The clouds broke, and he could see scattered lights from small towns spread across the landscape like embers. He was not a man who examined his own emotions. He had been trained out of that capacity young. His father had beaten softness out of him by the time he was 15. Emotion was weakness. Attachment was liability. Love was a tool that other people used against you. He had lived by that code for 20 years, and it had made him powerful beyond anything his father had imagined. But Rebecca had broken something in him that he could not fix with discipline or distance. She had broken his ability to pretend that the silence in his penthouse did not feel like grief. She had broken the wall that kept him from caring whether he came home at night. She had, without trying, without knowing, made him want to be something other than what he was. He looked at the lights below and admitted something to himself that he had never said out loud. He needed her, not as a maid, not as an employee. He needed her. While Minjun was flying west, Rebecca was making her move. It was 3 a.m. on her 7th night in the compound. She had studied the guard rotation for 3 days. There was a 4-minute gap between the north side patrol and the east perimeter check. 4 minutes to get through the laundry room window, cross the gravel yard, and reach the outer wall. The desert at night was freezing. She had not expected that. She was wearing the thin cotton uniform they gave all the women and a pair of canvas shoes that were already falling apart. The cold hit her like a wall the moment she dropped from the window onto the hard ground. She moved east toward what she believed was the main road about 2 miles away. The desert floor was rough, dotted with scrub brush and loose rock. She tripped twice, cut her hand on something sharp. She kept running. She made it 1.5 miles before headlights swept across the sand behind her. Ellis Pruitt's men caught her in a shallow ravine. 2 of them. They did not hurt her. They did not need to. They simply stood on either side of her and waited for the vehicle to pull up. Ellis got out. He looked at her with an expression that was almost disappointed, like a teacher dealing with a student who had failed to meet expectations. They brought her back to the compound and put her in an isolation room. It was a converted storage space at the end of the east wing. Concrete walls, a single overhead fluorescent light that buzzed constantly. No bed, no window, a locked steel door. Ellis stood on the other side of that door and spoke to her through it. "The next time you run, I make 1 phone call. I call the hospital and cancel every payment we have made toward your mother's treatment. Everything we covered gets reversed. And your mother dies waiting on a transplant list she will never climb. Do you understand me, Rebecca?" Rebecca sat on the cold concrete floor and said nothing. She pressed her back against the wall and stared at the door and said absolutely nothing. But something shifted inside her. Fear, which had been her constant companion for weeks now, cracked down the middle, and what came through the fracture was not panic or despair. It was rage, hot, clean, and focused. She was going to survive this. She did not know how yet, but she was going to survive. Minjun landed at Scottsdale Airport and set up at a private residence in Paradise Valley, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the entire state. The house belonged to a Korean-American business associate who owed Minjun a significant favor from a deal 3 years ago. No questions were asked. Keys were handed over within the hour. Soo-yeon had already mapped the compound from satellite imagery and local surveillance data. It sat on 40 acres of flat desert, a converted ranch property surrounded by low hills and dry brush. 8-foot walls around the main structures. Security cameras at regular intervals. 4 guards on rotation at all times, plus Ellis Pruitt and 2 administrative staff inside. At any given time, 5 to 8 women were being held on the property. Minjun's team was small. Di-ho, Yi-won, T-sik, and Soo-yeon on remote comms. They planned for a nighttime entry after 48 hours of surveillance to confirm patterns and identify blind spots. But during those 48 hours, something happened that changed everything. Victor Ashworth flew into Scottsdale. Soo-yeon intercepted the communication. A buyer was arriving in 3 days. A man from Dubai who had been in contact with Victor's network for months. He had reviewed portfolios. He had selected 2 women. One of them was Rebecca. The timeline collapsed. Minjun could not wait 48 hours. He could not afford to be careful or surgical or strategic. In 72 hours, Rebecca would be handed over to a man who would take her out of the country, and she would disappear in a way that even Min-jun's resources could not reverse. He looked at Di-ho across the kitchen counter of the Paradise Valley house and said, "We go tonight." While Min-jun was reorganizing his entire plan, Rebecca was sitting in the isolation room on her second day without a bed. She was given water twice a day, a sandwich once. The fluorescent light stayed on 24 hours a day, humming and buzzing, making sleep almost impossible. Her body was exhausted, but her mind refused to shut down. It kept cycling through images and memories like a projector stuck on repeat. She thought about her mother. Saturday mornings in Bridgeport when Pauline would sing while she cooked, her voice filling up their tiny kitchen like something warm and golden. The way she braided Rebecca's hair before church, her fingers gentle and sure. The time she worked 3 shifts in a single day, back to back to back, just so Rebecca could go on a school field trip to Washington. D.C. Rebecca had come home from that trip with a plastic replica of the Washington Monument, and a feeling she could not name at the time, but later understood, was the realization that her mother would burn herself to ash to keep her daughter warm. And now her mother was in a hospital bed, and Rebecca could not get to her. The thought was a knife that turned slowly. She thought about Min-jun. She thought about the morning she was crying in the kitchen and he appeared in the doorway, and she braced herself for the question. Everyone always asked the question, "What is wrong? Why are you crying? Are you okay?" But Min-jun did not ask the question. He walked to the stool beside her and sat down and said nothing. He stayed there for almost 20 minutes. When she finally stopped crying and wiped her face and said she was sorry, he looked at her and said, "Do not apologize," and then he went back upstairs. He never mentioned it again. He never made her feel small for being human in front of him. That was the moment she knew she was in trouble, because that was the moment she realized she had feelings for a man she absolutely could not have feelings for. She pressed her palms flat against the cold floor of the isolation room and whispered to herself in the dark, even though the light was still on, "I am going to get out of here." It was 11:47 p.m. when Min-jun's team approached the compound from the north side. The desert was black, no moon. The only light came from the compound itself, pale security floods that created pools of visibility surrounded by absolute darkness. Soo-yeon had spent the last 6 hours studying the camera feed remotely, and at exactly 11:45, she looped the footage. The guards watching the monitors inside saw empty hallways and quiet grounds. The reality was very different. Yiwon and Taesik moved through the darkness like they had been born in it. They reached the perimeter wall where it met a dry creek bed and scaled it in seconds. The first guard was neutralized before he knew anyone was there. Zip ties on the wrists, sedation injected through the sleeve. No noise, no violence. The second guard went down the same way 2 minutes later. Min-jun had been clear about one thing before they left Paradise Valley. No bodies. This was a rescue, not a war. He would handle Victor Ashworth later, and he would handle him thoroughly, but tonight was about one thing and one thing only. Di-ho breached the main building through a service entrance on the west side. He moved through a dark corridor and found the women's quarters. 2 shared rooms. 5 women inside, awake, pressed together, their faces tight with fear. They had heard the commotion from the guards and assumed the worst. Di-ho held up both hands to show they were empty. He spoke slowly and clearly. "We are getting you out, all of you, right now. No one is going to hurt you." One woman started crying. Another reached for Di-ho's arm like it was a lifeline. But Rebecca was not with them. A young woman named Joel, who had been in the compound for 3 months, whispered to Di-ho from the corner of the room. "They moved her, 2 days ago. The man with the glasses took her to the isolation wing, east side of the building, past the kitchen." Di-ho relayed the information through his earpiece. He did not even finish the sentence before Min-jun was already moving. The isolation wing was at the far end of the compound, a section of the building that had been a storage area before it was converted into something uglier. Concrete walls, heavy steel doors, no windows, the kind of space designed to make a person feel like the world had forgotten them. Min-jun found the door. It was locked with a heavy deadbolt. He pulled his weapon, a suppressed handgun he had not carried in 4 years, and fired a single round into the lock mechanism. The sound was a sharp whisper in the empty hallway. The lock shattered. The door swung open. Rebecca was sitting on the floor in the far corner of the room. She was thinner than he remembered. There were dark circles under her eyes so deep they looked like bruises. Her hands, resting on her knees, were trembling. The fluorescent light above her had been burning for 48 hours straight, and it had stripped something from her face, some layer of composure that she had always carried so effortlessly. She looked up when the door opened, and for a moment she did not seem to recognize what she was seeing. She blinked. She focused. And then her entire body went still, the way a person's body goes still when reality suddenly stops making sense. Min-jun was standing in the doorway, in Scottsdale, in a compound in the middle of the Arizona desert. He was standing there, and he was real. For 3 full seconds, neither of them moved or spoke. Then Rebecca said, in a voice that was hoarse and cracked from 2 days of silence, "You found me." Min-jun crossed the room in 2 steps. He pulled his jacket off and wrapped it around her shoulders. His hands were shaking. Min-jun's hands never shook. He had held weapons steady under fire. He had signed documents worth millions without a tremor. But his hands were shaking now, and he could not stop them. "I should have found you sooner," he said. Rebecca grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands and held on. It was not a hug. It was something more desperate than that. It was the grip of a person who had spent weeks wondering if she would ever touch something real again, something safe, something that was not a concrete wall or a locked door. She held on like she was anchoring herself to the first solid thing she had found since the world fell out from under her. He held her. He wrapped his arms around her and held her against his chest, and he did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say that his body was not already saying. On the way out of the building, they ran into Ellis Prout in the main corridor. He was holding a phone in one hand. He had been trying to call for backup. Min-jun stepped in front of Rebecca. The look on his face was something that Ellis clearly recognized because the man stopped moving immediately. All the color drained from his skin. "You know who I am," Min-jun said. Ellis swallowed. He did. Everyone in their world knew the Yoon name. "This was a legitimate business arrangement," Ellis said. His voice was shaking. "She signed a contract. Everything was documented. This is legal." "She signed under duress. You exploited a woman who was trying to save her dying mother, and then you locked her in a concrete room for 2 days to break her will before selling her to a buyer from Dubai." Min-jun's voice was quiet, almost gentle. That was the most frightening part. "There is nothing legitimate about you." He took the phone from Ellis's hand, removed the battery, dropped both pieces on the floor. Then he turned to Di-ho, who had appeared behind them with the other women. "Restrain him. Collect every file, every hard drive, every document in this building. Then call the FBI tip line from a burner phone, anonymously. Let them clean up what is left." He turned back to Rebecca. "Can you walk?" She nodded. They walked out of the compound and into the desert night. The air was cold and clean and enormous. Above them, the sky was filled with more stars than Rebecca had seen in years. She stopped just outside the wall and stood there for a moment, breathing, just breathing, filling her lungs with air that did not taste like concrete and fluorescent light. Min-jun stood beside her and waited. He did not rush her. He did not tell her they needed to move. He just stood there in the cold desert darkness and let her breathe. Min-jun brought Rebecca and the other 5 women to the Paradise Valley house. A private doctor was waiting when they arrived. Rebecca was dehydrated, sleep-deprived, and had lost 11 pounds. The doctor put her on IV fluids, treated the cuts on her hands, and insisted on a minimum of 12 hours of uninterrupted rest. Rebecca argued. She wanted to call her mother. She wanted to know what was happening. The doctor looked at Min-jun, who looked at Rebecca with an expression that was as close to pleading as his face was capable of producing. 12 hours, he said. Then I will tell you everything, and you can call your mother. She slept for 14. While Rebecca rested, the other women experienced freedom for the first time in weeks, and in some cases, months. They were given rooms, clean clothes, hot food, and access to phones. One woman called her sister in Houston and broke down sobbing so hard she could not form words for the first 5 minutes. Another called her 6-year-old daughter in Atlanta. The little girl answered and said, "Mommy, where did you go?" And every person within earshot had to leave the room. Joel sat in the kitchen and ate 4 plates of food without pausing. When she finally stopped, she looked at Di-ho, who was standing near the door, and said, Is this real? Yes, Diho said. It is real. Minjun handled all of it. He arranged legal representation for every woman. He contacted a nonprofit organization that specialized in trafficking survivors and set up long-term support services. He paid for everything without being asked, without keeping a record, without expecting anything in return. He made 23 phone calls in 6 hours, all from the kitchen counter while Rebecca slept in the next room. Diho watched him work through the night and said quietly, "You have changed." Minjun did not respond. When Rebecca woke up, the afternoon sun was coming through the blinds in golden stripes. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, her body registering unfamiliar comfort. A real bed, clean sheets, silence, no buzzing fluorescent light. Then she turned her head and saw Minjun sitting in a chair by the window. He was still in the same clothes from the night before. He had not slept. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You need to know why I did not come to you." He said, "I know why." "No," she said. "You do not." She pushed herself up to sitting. "I did not come to you because I was afraid, not of you, of what it would mean if I asked you for help. Every man I have ever owed something to has used it to control me. My father left when I was 12, but before he left, he made sure my mother felt like she owed him for every day he stayed. My mother's landlord used to hold rent over her head to make her do things she did not want to do. My first boss used to remind me every single day that he was the one who gave me a chance." She paused. "I told myself a long time ago that I would never put myself in that position again, not with anyone, not even with you." She looked down at her hands. "Especially not with you, because you are the one it would hurt the most to lose." The room was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that has weight. Then Minjun said, "You do not owe me anything, Rebecca. Not now, not ever. You never did." She looked at him, and something in her eyes shifted. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that could become trust if given enough time and enough proof. But the situation was far from over. Victor Ashworth had not been at the compound during the raid. He had received a backup alert from one of Ellis's secondary phones just before the FBI tip came in, and he had left Scottsdale immediately. He knew someone had hit his operation, and it did not take him long to figure out who. Victor was not a man who panicked. He was a man who calculated, and he had connections that extended far beyond the criminal underworld. He knew a U.S. senator personally. He had a working relationship with a deputy director at the DEA, and he had contacts inside the FBI's organized crime division. Victor made a single phone call to someone inside the bureau. He fed them information about the Yoon syndicate, shipment routes, shell company structures, names and dates and account numbers. And he framed the Scottsdale compound raid not as a rescue, but as a hostile takeover of a rival trafficking operation. Within 24 hours, the FBI opened an active investigation into Minjun. The call came from Minjun's attorney in New York while they were still in Arizona. The attorney's voice was tight with urgency. "You need to come back east. Now, they are building a case against you. Someone inside gave them everything. This is not exploratory, Minjun. This is active." Minjun stood in the hallway of the Paradise Valley house, phone pressed to his ear. When he hung up, Rebecca was standing in the doorway of her room, watching his face. She had spent 2 years reading that face. She knew what his jaw did when he was angry. She knew what his eyes did when he was thinking. And right now, she could see something she had never seen before. Concern. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at her. "The man who took you, he is fighting back." Minjun returned to Connecticut with Rebecca. He installed her in a secure residence in Cos Cob, a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood near the water. The house was modest by his standards, but beautiful by anyone else's. 3 bedrooms, a garden, a view of the Long Island Sound. He placed a 2-man security detail outside and had the house swept for surveillance devices before she set foot inside. Rebecca protested the security. She said she did not need babysitters. Minjun did not argue with her. He simply said, "Until Ashworth is dealt with, you are not safe, and neither is your mother." At the mention of her mother, Rebecca went completely still. "My mother, is she?" "She is alive," Minjun said. "Still at St. Vincent's. I have had someone watching her room since the day I found out where you were. No one has approached her. She is stable." He paused. "And I have already spoken with the transplant team at Yale New Haven Hospital. She is being transferred and evaluated for the transplant list. I am covering all costs." Rebecca stared at him. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed. She blinked several times. "Why?" she said. "Because it matters to you," Minjun said. "So it matters to me." She did not respond to that. She could not. Because if she opened her mouth again, she was going to cry, and she had already done enough crying in Arizona to last her a lifetime. The war with Victor Ashworth played out over the next 2 weeks like a chess match between two men who both understood power, but who wielded it in very different ways. Victor believed he held the advantage. The FBI was actively investigating Minjun. Victor had positioned himself not as a suspect, but as a cooperating witness, a concerned citizen who had stumbled upon evidence of Korean organized crime activity in Arizona. He had lawyers. He had political contacts. He had the confidence of a man who had spent decades building a system that protected him while destroying others. But Minjun had Soo-yeon. And Soo-yeon had spent the last week pulling apart Victor Ashworth's digital life, like someone unraveling a sweater thread by thread. She found everything. Encrypted messages between Victor and buyers in Dubai, Qatar, and London, negotiating prices for human beings like they were discussing real estate. Financial records showing payments for the placement of 14 women over a 3-year period. Photographs of forged documents, fake passports, fake employment contracts, fake identities. Internal communications between Victor and Ellis Prout discussing which women were ready for transfer and which needed more preparation. And then she found the crown jewel, a recorded phone call between Victor Ashworth and a sitting United States congressman from Connecticut discussing the logistics of moving women through private aviation channels to avoid TSA documentation requirements. The congressman's voice was clear. His name was mentioned twice. The call lasted 11 minutes. Minjun reviewed the evidence in his office in Greenwich. He sat behind his desk with the coffee mug on the right side, next to the window, and he read through every file, listened to every recording, and studied every document. Then he made a decision. He did not take the evidence to the FBI. He did not trust them, not with a compromised source feeding them false information about his organization, not with Victor's contacts embedded in the system. Instead, he did something more devastating than any criminal prosecution could accomplish. He gave the evidence to the press. Soo-yeon packaged everything into an encrypted file and transmitted it simultaneously to 3 journalists, one at the New York Times, one at ProPublica, and one at a major investigative podcast that had built a following of 12 million listeners on stories exactly like this. The transmission came from an untraceable server and included a single accompanying note. Victor Ashworth, Westport, CT, 14 women, all the proof you need. The story broke 48 hours later. Victor Ashworth's name was everywhere, every network, every newspaper, every social media feed in the country. The congressman issued a panicked denial that convinced no one. His staff resigned within hours. The FBI, suddenly and publicly embarrassed by the revelation that they had been investigating the wrong person while a trafficking operation ran openly in their jurisdiction, pivoted hard. They dropped the investigation into Minjun quietly, without apology, and opened a federal case against Victor Ashworth with the kind of speed that only happens when an agency is trying to save face. Federal agents raided Victor's estate in Westport at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. News helicopters circled overhead. Camera crews lined the private road leading to the property. Victor Ashworth was walked out in handcuffs, wearing a bathrobe, squinting against the morning light and the flash of cameras. He was charged with 11 federal counts, including human trafficking, wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. Bail was denied. Ellis Prout, already in custody from the Arizona raid, cut a deal with prosecutors within days. He agreed to testify against Victor in exchange for a reduced sentence. The other women from the compound were contacted by federal victim advocates. 3 of them agreed to testify at trial. Joel was one of them. She told prosecutors she would stand in that courtroom and say every word, and she did not care who was listening. Rebecca watched the arrest on television from the house in Cos Cob. She sat on the couch with a cup of tea she had not touched, and she watched them walk Victor Ashworth out of his front door, the same man who had sat across from her in a coffee shop in Stamford and smiled while he dismantled her freedom. She did not cry. She did not cheer. She just exhaled, long and slow and deep, like she had been holding her breath for a month and her lungs had finally remembered what they were for. Then she picked up her phone and called her mother's hospital room. It rang 3 times before Pauline answered. Her voice was weak and thin, but it was warm. "Baby, is that you?" "Yeah, Mama, it is me. I am okay. I am coming to see you tomorrow." "Where have you been, sweetheart? I have been so worried. Nobody could tell me anything." "I know, I am sorry, Mama, but I am safe now, I promise you, I am safe." When she hung up, Min-jun was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. He had come in through the back door. He had heard everything. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. She was smiling. "Thank you," she said, "for my mother, for finding me, for all of it." He shook his head slightly. "You do not have to thank me." "I know I do not have to. I want to." 3 months passed. The seasons turned in Connecticut. Winter settled in, then softened into a spring that came early and arrived gently, the way spring sometimes does in the Northeast when the year decides to be kind. Pauline Townsend received her kidney transplant at Yale New Haven Hospital on a Tuesday morning in March. The surgery lasted 6 hours. The transplant team was one of the best in the country, and they had been preparing for this for weeks. Rebecca sat in the waiting room for every one of those 6 hours. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She sat in a hard plastic chair and stared at the door the surgeon would eventually walk through, and she waited. Min-jun sat beside her. He had canceled 3 meetings that day, a call with his operations leadership in Seoul, and a dinner with a business partner whose net worth exceeded $200 million. He did not mention any of this to Rebecca. He simply showed up at the hospital at 6 a.m. and sat down next to her and stayed. At one point, around the 4-hour mark, Rebecca's knee started bouncing, a nervous habit she had carried since childhood. Min-jun reached over and placed his hand on her knee, gently, not possessively, just enough to say, "I am here." She looked at his hand, then at his face, and then she placed her hand on top of his and left it there. When the surgeon came through the door at 2:17 p.m. and said that Pauline was stable, that the transplant had been successful, that she was in recovery and expected to make a full return to health, Rebecca broke down. Not the quiet, managed tears she had trained herself to produce over a lifetime of learning to keep her pain small and contained. This was the real thing. Full, open, shaking sobs that came from a place so deep inside her it did not have a name. Relief, grief, exhaustion, joy. Everything she had been carrying for months, for years, poured out of her in a hospital waiting room full of strangers. Min-jun pulled her into him. He wrapped both arms around her and held her against his chest, and he did not care who was watching. He did not care about the curious glances from other families. He did not care what it looked like, the most powerful man on the East Coast holding a woman in a hospital hallway while she cried so hard she could barely breathe. He had spent his entire adult life caring about perception and control, and the careful management of how the world saw him. In this moment, none of it mattered. She cried until she could not cry anymore, and then she stayed in his arms because she did not want to move. 2 weeks later, Pauline was recovering. She was transferred to a rehabilitation center in Stamford, close to Rebecca. Min-jun covered every expense without being asked and without making a production of it. Rebecca discovered the extent of what he had done only when a lawyer called her to explain the paperwork for a trust fund Min-jun had established in Pauline's name, designed to cover her medical care and living expenses for the rest of her life. Rebecca drove to Greenwich that afternoon. She walked into Min-jun's penthouse through the front door, the same door she used to enter as staff. It felt different now. The same marble floors, the same enormous windows overlooking the Long Island Sound, but she was not here with a cleaning cart and a schedule. She was here as herself. Min-jun was in his office. He looked up from his desk when she walked in. "You set up a trust for my mother," she said. "Yes." "Without telling me." "You would have argued." "You are absolutely right. I would have." She paused. "Because I have spent my entire life believing that when someone gives you something, they are eventually going to take something back. That is what I was taught. That is what I lived, every single time." She stepped closer to him. But you flew across the country and walked into a compound in the desert and pulled me out of a concrete room. You saved 5 other women you had no obligation to save. You went to war with a man who could have destroyed you. And you never once, not one single time, made me feel like I owed you for any of it. Min-jun stood up from his desk. He came around to the front of it and stood a few feet from her, close enough to reach, not so close that she felt pressured. You changed me, Rebecca, he said. Before you, I was building something I did not care about. I was running an empire for people I did not trust, in a world that never asked me to be anything other than cold. You made me want to be more than that. I did not do anything, she said. I just made your coffee. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. You put it on the right side of the desk. Because the view is better on that side. I know. I never looked at the view until you told me to. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. His fingers closed around hers, and she could feel the steadiness of his grip, the same hands that had shaken in a doorway in Arizona, steady now, sure now. He pulled her closer, slowly, carefully, like he was holding something that mattered more than anything he had ever held. She looked up at him. I am not going to be easy, she said. I need you to know that. I have trust issues the size of this penthouse. I am going to push you away at least 4 times before I let you stay. I have negotiated with cartels, he said. I can handle 4 times. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind that filled the room and bounced off the marble floors and made the whole penthouse feel alive the way it used to feel when she lived here, except better now. Warmer. Like a place 2 people could belong to instead of 1 person hiding in. He kissed her, soft and slow, the kind of kiss that does not rush because it knows it has time. The kind of kiss that says, I am not going anywhere, and I do not want you to go anywhere either. She kissed him back, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Rebecca Townsend was not surviving. She was living. 6 months after that kiss, this is where things stood. Rebecca had moved into a townhouse in Greenwich that Min-jun purchased and put in her name. Not his name. Hers. Her name on the deed. Her keys. Her home. She had insisted on that, and he had agreed without argument because he was learning that loving Rebecca Townsend meant respecting the parts of her that had been shaped by pain, not trying to smooth them out. Pauline Townsend was fully recovered and living in a beautiful assisted care apartment in Stamford. She had met Min-jun twice. The first time, she studied him for a long, quiet moment, the way only mothers study the people their children bring home. Then she said, You are the one who found my daughter. He nodded. She reached out and took his hand and held it and said, Then you are family. Min-jun, who had faced down men with weapons and federal agents with warrants and never flinched, had to look away to keep his composure. Joel testified at Victor Ashworth's federal trial. She sat in the witness chair for 4 hours and told her story in full. She did not waver. She did not break. The other women who testified were equally strong. Victor Ashworth was convicted on all 11 counts and sentenced to 34 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The congressman resigned from office 3 days before the verdict, his career destroyed, his legacy reduced to a single mugshot. The story of the Scottsdale compound won a Peabody Award for the journalists who broke it. 13 women in total were identified as victims of Victor's network. All of them received support services. All of them were rebuilding their lives. Min-jun was still who he was. He still ran an empire. He still operated in shadows and made decisions that ordinary people would never understand. He was not suddenly a good man by conventional standards, and Rebecca did not pretend he was. But he was a man who had discovered. Late in life, and against every instinct his father had beaten into him, that strength was not the absence of feeling. It was the willingness to feel something and act on it anyway. Every morning, Min-jun sat at his desk in the Greenwich penthouse. His coffee was on the right side, next to the window. He looked at the view before he took his first sip. Sometimes Rebecca was there, standing in the kitchen with her own mug, rolling her eyes at whatever ridiculous thing Deho had said during the morning briefing. Sometimes she was at her own place, living her own life, building something that belonged to her. But every night, there was a light on in the townhouse when he came home. And there was a woman inside who was not afraid of him, who did not flinch, who once told him his $4,000 whiskey tasted like angry campfire and made him laugh for the first time in years. He still drank that whiskey sometimes. It still tasted like angry campfire. He did not mind. Rebecca Townsend had walked into Min Jun's world with nothing but a work ethic and a pair of steady hands. She walked out of a nightmare in the Arizona desert with the same thing she had always carried, the refusal to be broken. And Min Jun, a man who was raised to believe that love was the most dangerous weakness a person could have, learned that the strongest thing he ever did was cross a country to bring one woman home. Sometimes the people who change your life do not arrive with power or status or a name that opens doors. Sometimes they arrive with a mop and a sticky note that says, "Eat something." And sometimes that is more than enough.